We continue our studies in Exodus today by looking at Exodus chapter 22 and verses 21 to 31. All that God has just said in the preceding verses must not let us think that the Lord only hates the sort of conduct that most moral people would themselves also despise. Thus in verses 21 to 27, God reveals his wish that his people are expected to show care and compassion to all, especially those in every society who are in the greatest need. Any conduct by believers which fails at this point is equally hated by God. Yet how little attention God's people often give to the attitudes expected of them, which are revealed in these verses. The importance of these laws was immediately impressed upon the people by the reminder that you were aliens in Egypt, as we read in verse 21. The Lord had shown compassion to a poor, helpless people in Egypt, and the same attitude was therefore required of them, and no less is true for us. We were helpless in sin, but God did everything he could, even to the death of his own Son, to show us mercy. It's extraordinary, then, if we do not show mercy to those whose needs are quite as great as ours were. The groups of people mentioned here were those who were most likely to be in need in ancient society. An alien, mentioned in verse 21, was a non-Israelite who was living with the people of God but who did not have full citizenship. Such did not have family property, which was handed down from generation to generation. Usually they would have earned a living by day labouring. They may not have had access to the judicial system of Israel, and thus they were in danger of fraud and exploitation, and for being despised as members of another race. Widows and orphans were also vulnerable, as in so many societies today. Because they did not have an adult male to provide a living for them and protect their interests, they were in danger. A failure among the Israelites to show practical compassion for these people was therefore a very serious matter, and the Lord threatened death upon culprits, but did not delegate the responsibility to anyone else. He would act. Once again we notice that the penalty is that which symbolizes complete exclusion from the people of God. Just as the Egyptians became widows and orphans as a result of God's judgment, so the Israelites would suffer the same fate. The New Testament is no less concerned for the Lord's people to show compassion, and emphasizes that the gospel of Jesus breaks down the barriers between people, which lead to the exploitation of one by another. Just read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 22. And Jesus shows that love is to be shown even for our enemies. He makes this clear in Matthew 5, verses 43 to 48. We're not only to meet the needs of others, but to lavish help upon them, as Jesus emphasized in that same passage in Matthew in verses 38 to 42. This is the mark of a true disciple, someone who is a real Christian. The law given in verses 25 to 27 relating to loans has often been misunderstood. Many Christians have concluded that it forbids taking interest on loans. But this misses the point of the original law. The purpose of the law was not to provide rules for the financing of business ventures. Presumably in such circumstances, Israelite law would have allowed loans. Rather, this law was given by God to protect the poor in society who were forced to seek a loan because of their poverty. In many societies today, the poor are crippled by the interest payments due on loans, which they had to seek because of their desperate need. It is this danger that God's law seeks to avoid. Where a genuine need existed, it was the religious duty of the Israelite to help. The Lord was compassionate and expected the same conduct of his people. Moreover, if a pledge was sought to guarantee the repayment of a loan, it was to be returned when needed. Such open-handed generosity was expected of God's people, and it characterized the church in its early years, as we see, for example, in Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. But it is very often missing today. Few churches today could be commended like that in Macedonia in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. And yet Paul clearly regarded the generosity of that church as a mark of their love for the Lord Jesus Christ, as he emphasizes in verses 8 and 9 in the same chapter. The last 4 verses in chapter 22 of Exodus recount several of the people's responsibilities to the Lord. Both the Lord and the ruler were to be respected, and the New Testament is equally explicit on this point, as for example we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 1. The linking of the ruler and the Lord in the same law was probably intended to emphasize that to act against a ruler is to act against God himself. While this does not rule out conscientious withholding of obedience for Christ's sake, as we see in Matthew 22 verse 21, that is, when a rule infringes the Lord's rights, this does stress a solemn responsibility to be good citizens. Verse 29 is not very clear. However, it was probably intended as a reminder that the people were to support the Lord's work without doing so grudgingly. The support of the tabernacle and the priesthood would have required a considerable annual income from God's people. A system of tithes and offerings was instituted to meet this need, as we see, for example, in Leviticus chapter 27 verses 30 to 33 and Numbers 18 verse 21. Now, these offerings were compulsory, rather like an income tax today. The New Testament sets no compulsory standard for the giving of God's people. However, it does teach us that our giving is to be done generously and cheerfully. It guarantees the Lord's blessing on those who do so. Just look at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 to 15. Is the spiritual poverty of so many Christians and churches today the result of disobedience and a failure to live faithfully in their giving? It's not surprising that the next law in verses 29 and 30 reminded the Israelites of their responsibility to give the Lord the firstborn males in their families, herds and flocks. In the case of their sons, a redemption payment was to be made, as we see in Exodus chapter 34, verses 19 to 20. The firstborn animals were, however, to be sacrificed. It's clear from the Bible that the firstborn of Israel were representative of the people as a whole. Just as the judgment of God upon the firstborn in Egypt was intended as a statement of his wrath against the whole nation, so his demand for the consecration of the firstborn in Israel was intended to teach his people that they were all to be holy to the Lord. Their lives were to be devoted to him. Paul made the same point in Romans 12 verse 1 when speaking of all Christians. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, he said. Thus our lives, and the best that we are to be devoted to him. When we see this, we're able to understand that the tithe was also intended to symbolize the same point. Whatever the level of our giving, and that will vary as a result of our personal circumstances, our gifts are to be offered as tokens of lives completely dedicated to the Lord. No other giving is acceptable to God. Later, elaborate dietary laws were given to the Israelites. These laws made hygienic sense for the people in ancient Palestine. However, their purpose too was symbolic. The laws were intended to make a distinction between the sacred and the non-sacred, and these laws seem to have been especially given to the priests to emphasize the holiness of their responsibilities and duties. And this thinking lies behind verse 31, though the particular reason why an animal torn by beasts should not be eaten is not known. Nevertheless, the fact that all the people were intended to observe the law taught them that they were all to be holy, as we see again in Leviticus 19 verse 2. There was no suggestion then that the priests were to have a different standard of holiness than the rest of the people. All were to be priests in respect of the holiness of their lives. The same demand rests upon Christians. Yet how often do believers give the impression that there is one standard of holiness for their leaders and another, far lower standard for themselves? How often Christians excuse their own sinful actions by thinking that the Bible's standard of holiness does not apply to ordinary people like them. This law in Exodus exposes such thinking as the sinful thinking that it really is.